Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Environmental Social Justice. I'm your host, Wendy Nystrom, and today we welcome back Rex Frazier. He is the president of the Personal Insurance Federation of California, or the PIFC. Welcome back, Rex.
Thanks for having me back.
Anytime, and sorry for screwing up your name. I got COVID shots yesterday, and I'm a little out of it today. I'm a little fighting off that vaccine. I'll be fine in a couple days. But going on the PIFC, what does that do? What does that do for the state of California?
What does our organization do?
Yes.
So we represent the very large property casualty insurance companies, names you would recognize, State Farm, Farmers, Allstate, Liberty Mutual, companies like that. Almost 70% of the market share of homeowners insurance that's sold in California. So we're a Sacramento-based group that we help these companies talk with the legislature on bills, talk with the governor's office or the Department of Insurance, or if it's an auto insurance issue, it could be the Bureau of Automotive Repair or the DMV, whatever regulatory agency, there's an issue that would affect the insurance industry. We help them advocate there, formulate an opinion and advocate there. Formulating the opinion is probably the hardest part because these are all diehard competitors who are forced to sit at a conference table and figure out some unified position. But sometimes competition, makes that hard because a particular rule might help one company more than another. And then we try to help them see that there's a bigger picture. We're generally successful, but that's hard. Unfortunately, sometimes we'll have to go to court if we think, let's say, a Department of Insurance regulation goes beyond what the legislature has authorized, then we'll go to court and seek to get that stayed. And then we help them with their politics, particularly their grassroots organizing of all their agents. There are thousands of agents that serve every community and they want to have a voice. And so we help organize those folks as well.
So basically communication, facilitating relationships for the carriers.
And lawyering and lobbying.
Lawyering and lobbying. Fantastic. So we have seen in the state of California quite a few insurance carriers either leave the marketplace with respect to homeowners insurance or severely restrict the coverages they're offering. And those carriers are Allstate, State Farm, Farmers, AIG, AmGuard, Falls Lake, and Chubb. This is forcing people to get coverage in something called the FAIR plan, which is FAIR. And the big joke is the FAIR plan isn't fair. And it is the insurance of last resort. Could you tell, as simply as possible, the history of the FAIR plan, why it was created, and how it's kind of oversaturated with wildfire risk right now?
You bet. The FAIR plan was formed in response to the Watts civil unrest in the late 60s in Los Angeles. And it was primarily a small business mechanism. So what the FAIR plan is think of it like it's an insurance company, but it's an insurance company that is backed by the entire insurance industry. And so in the statute, the FAIR plan is referred to as a private non-voluntary association of insurance companies, meaning that if an insurance company wants to do business in the state of California, in order to get their license, they must become a member of the FAIR plan and subject themselves to the rules of the FAIR plan's plan of operation, which the Department of Insurance controls. So there's no taxpayer dollars in the FAIR plan. It is 100% funded by insurance premiums charged. And when those premiums are insufficient, it is 100% backed by the insurance industry. So if there's a major loss and the FAIR plan is, let's say, $1 billion short, well, they turn around and go to the insurance companies and say, well, we're short of $1 billion. Hey, State Farm, you write 21% of the market. So how about giving us, $420 million out of your bank account? And thank you very much. You've just paid for the claims of people where you've never collected any premium for that business. But hey, it's a non-voluntary association of private insurers, so you have that obligation, right? So the FAIR plan is subject to prior approval rate making of the Department of Insurance. So when the Department of Insurance, or or when the FAIR Plan needs to increase their rates, they have to go to the Department of Insurance and ask for permission. And they have to comply with the Department of Insurance's complicated rate-making formula, which is very complicated.
It is.
And the FAIR Plan was recently granted a 15% increase after they had to wait 2 years of negotiating with the Department of Insurance.
Premium increase you're referring to?
A rate increase of 15% that they asked for 2 years prior. Now, I don't know what other business in the United States is told that they have to continue providing service and they can't change their price. But that is what the insurance industry is subject to, as if they were a utility like PG&E or Southern California Edison, and they have a dedicated service area where they're the monopoly provider.
Yeah.
That same rate capping structure is applied to the competitive insurance industry where there's hundreds of insurance companies. And while some would love that because they think, let's stick it to those insurance companies and make it hard for them to increase their prices, those same cheerleaders should at least own the consequences of that, which is in times like this, when inflation is rampant, we're dealing with changing weather patterns and the impact of climate change. So the underlying cost structure of these insurance companies is going up and up. And then it takes a year or two to change your prices. Do we really expect insurance companies to just keep doing what they're doing?
Yeah.
That's unreasonable. And so for the FAIR Plan, as much as some people might want to call them the unfair plan, well, their prices are controlled by the Department of Insurance. So I defy anyone to tell me how their charges are too high when the state of California can take a year or two at a time and come up with an answer.
Yeah.
And remember, the FAIR Plan is an entitlement. Everybody has the ability to get fire insurance in California that satisfies a mortgage lender through the FAIR Plan. When someone says they cannot get fire insurance, that is never true. It's never true because everybody can go to the FAIR Plan and get insurance. And if the state controls the price and the FAIR Plan cannot control the risk that comes into their portfolio, that's a recipe for bankruptcy.
Yes,
and
it is.
So right now we have the FAIR Plan growing faster than any private insurance company in the state of California. Their obligations are outstripping their capital reserves by a shocking degree. And so far, our official public policy going into peak fire season this fall is to cross our fingers and hope there's not a big fire. Because if there is a big fire and the FAIR Plan runs out of money, they can just start assessing the insurance companies on a market share basis. And those insurance companies, while they're paying their other fire claims from their normal business, are then going to be asked to give millions, tens of millions, in the largest companies, hundreds of millions of dollars right out of the surplus of the company. And that triggers a whole cascade of really, really bad things. Because insurance companies are only allowed to have in force a certain amount of business compared to the underlying capital that they hold. There's something called a leverage ratio that says you can only have a certain amount of premium in force based on how much capital you have. It's like what we do for banks. We make banks hold a certain amount of capital back so that they can satisfy depositor demands for withdrawals. They can't just loan out all their money and have no capital remaining. Yeah. So it's the same thing for insurance companies. They have to have solvency protections to make sure they have enough capital to pay their promises, which that's what insurance policy is. It's a promise to pay. And so if all of a sudden their underlying capital has a big chunk taken out of it, well, they wouldn't be allowed to keep their existing number of customers because they would be over leveraged. And then they would have to non-renew tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of policies in order to comply with the solvency rules. So I think a lot of people, it's easy for them to just kind of joke and say, oh, isn't this great? The FAIR Plan, we can hold up their rate level for 2 years. You know, they needed 60% is what the formula said. They asked for 30, they got 15, and it took 2 years. And so in the meantime, they're growing faster than any insurance company in the state of California.
Yeah.
The largest provider of private insurance right now is Farmers Insurance. You know, we know that they announced they're capping their new business at 7,000 policies a month.
Yes.
And last month, the FAIR Plan received 25,000 applications. They were able to issue 13,000 policies. So they're growing at an astounding rate, and they're growing in a manner that at some point, if it's not addressed, it's only a matter of when they will have a massive fire obligation where they won't have enough money. They will assess all the insurance companies. And for smaller insurance companies, it could drive them into a hazardous financial position or even impair them. And for larger companies, it's going to take a big chunk out of their surplus. That's going to put them out of leverage. And then they're going to have to non-renew hundreds of thousands of homes. So if we think things are bad now, I don't want to be a bummer, but it's just, this is the reality.
That's fact.
The FAIR Plan growth is unsustainable. And if we don't come up with a way to make sure the FAIR Plan is sustainable and doesn't bankrupt the insurance companies, then we're in for a real hurt.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm glad you explained it the way you did, because most people think, okay, the big bad insurance companies, they're charging too much. The reality is insurance is not a charitable organization. They are for profit. They need to make money. If they lose more money than they bring in, they go out of business.
Well, so a couple of things on that. I mean, the majority of insurance policies sold in California aren't even sold by shareholder-owned companies. When you hear a term like mutual, State Farm Mutual, Liberty Mutual, Nationwide Mutual, that means they don't have shareholders. They're a co-op. These are companies that were formed, in State Farm's case, in a rural area of Illinois, where folks wanted to make sure they could all pitch their money in together and make sure if one person's barn burns down, everybody else pitches in to pay for it. Right? Yeah. These are mutual aid companies. That's what State Farm Mutual means. So this isn't some, Wall Street is jamming up the insurance companies to get unreasonable profits. And even if they were, we have price control laws in California that put a cap on profits.
Yes.
Right? And if a company makes too much money over an extended period of time, the department can go to them and force their rates down. So we have price controls here. And when someone doesn't like the price that they're getting charged, it's hard for me to understand what else we're supposed to do. These are prices that have been vetted by the Department of Insurance. And if the price controls are administered too harshly, then companies will not have enough money in the system to pay the highest risk claims. And guess what they're going to do? They're going to non-renew those policies that are outside of their ability to pay.
Yeah. No, and that was my point being, is that if you have oversaturated your market and they're not pulling in enough premium to cover the losses that could happen, that probably will happen, then you just have basically a domino effect, as you were outlining earlier.
Yeah, and it's really hard, because I think there's this disconnect where we talk about climate change and the need for adaptation and resilience on a daily basis in our political discourse. But then somehow we turn around and say the one industry that's really closely connected to signals with climate change, which is the insurance companies, then we get mad if premium goes up or if they're not able to fund losses in the highest risk areas that are directly in line with climate risk.
Yes. No, I mean, and that's why the thing I wanted to really focus on today was our insurance commissioner made an announcement last Friday, September 22nd, basically saying that they have a plan to bring the insurance industry back to California, to allow them to factor in climate change and look on a forward-thinking basis. All other states, or many other states, already do that. We do not. We only look at historical data in the past. We're now going to be able to look forward and factor in those climate change factors. How is that going? Like, it's a great announcement. Awesome. Really excited. What's the reality?
Yeah, that's the right question to ask, I think. I think we looked at it like an important, positive first step, but there's so many complications ahead that we're going to have to work through. Now, the overall framework, as we understand it, is that the Department of Insurance would consider allowing insurance companies to do two things for wildfire that right now only earthquake insurance companies can do in California. So this isn't an unheard of concept that we're talking about here. It's that the regulations that were drafted in the early 1990s, when earthquake was top of mind and wildfire was just a remote thing, the regulations allow earthquake insurers to do two things that it's a must to allow wildfire insurers to do. So the first, and this is a little bit of a boring actuarial explanation, but the first thing is when you formulate an insurance rate, one of the elements of the formula that the department has is a company projects their losses. That's an actuarial, more than guess, but scientifically trained guess, saying we think the frequency and severity of our future losses will be this. Mm-hmm. Well, under current regulations for wildfire insurers, the way they project their losses forward is they just take a simple average of the last 20 years of their wildfire losses. And so it doesn't matter where the insurance company plans on doing business. They could be planning on doing business in much lower risk areas or higher risk areas, but the formula doesn't discern that. The formula just says, oh, we're going to look backward and see what happened over the last 20 years. And we look at that and say, well, I think we all agree that 20 years ago doesn't really capture what's happening with today's weather patterns. So why in the world would we be projecting our future losses based upon 20-year-old data? And so what every other state, it's not just that we're an outlier, we're an extreme outlier. There's no other state that does it the way California does it, where we hold on to this average over the last 20 years concept. In every other state, you're allowed to say, well, here's how we're going to construct a model of where we do business and the homes that we insure, the home's proximity to fuel, whether it's chaparral or brush or grass or trees. We look at the home quality. Does it have a Class A roof and all these mitigation things for defensible space and home hardening? You run different scenarios on what could happen. Those homes are near a big hillside that exacerbates fire behavior. Those homes are in the way of a known wind corridor that can change fire behavior. You run different scenarios, and based upon a much more complicated view of the world, you're able to project what you're likely to face in the way of frequency and severity of losses. Okay. Yeah. So, and for earthquake insurers, that's the way they project their losses. They say, where are our homes located that we insure? What's their proximity to a fault line? You would think that would be an important part of projecting your losses.
A little bit.
For wildfire, we say, oh, we're not going to look at your proximity to a forest or your proximity to a bunch of sagebrush or a bunch of grass like in Lahaina. We're just going to say we're going to look backward, and we're not going to pay attention to where you plan on doing business, and somehow we're going to think that's an accurate projection of losses. Well, that's the way we do it in California. We think it has to change, and companies are not going to be able to go into the very highest risk areas without a forward-looking approach, because the way it works is, think about this, the only way under our current rules you can get permission to charge more is you have to pay huge losses. So no company is going to run into a high-risk area, pay a bunch of losses merely for the privilege of being granted a rate increase. That's not the way this is going to work.
It wouldn't be sufficient anyway.
People would lose their jobs.
Yeah.
So the way the forward-looking process goes is, if you're going to restrict, the model will say your losses are going to go down and you can't justify a rate increase. If you're going to go into Tuolumne County, where it's a county that could just go up and be half on fire, well, you can write business there under a higher rate level. That's the way these models work. There's no guarantee that any rate's going to go up or down. It's what a company chooses to do, and the model will pick up those plans for their underwriting rules. Are they going to rule out certain zip codes? Are they going to rule in certain zip codes? If they rule them out, they're going to charge less. If they rule them in, they're going to charge more. But the models allow a company to go into riskier areas because they can charge enough to pay for it. The current system punishes a company because if a company's already taking a risk, or they've already taken risk out of their portfolio, now they're stuck at a lower risk level.
Yeah.
How can they get permission to charge a higher rate and go into a higher risk area under current rules? They can't. So they're stuck staying out of these high risk areas. That's a mistake. and that's why we're stuck now. So
I mean, it does sound like it's a positive move in the right direction.
That's right.
To actually start looking at the climate change and forward thing. I'm a little perplexed as to why we are the one state left that still looks in the past. I don't know what the thought process of that was, but that's fine. I don't need to know that.
Well, just look at the critics' comments. The critics of this, they just want to say, oh, technology scary. Black box, it's going to be used for a nefarious purpose. And you're like, well, earthquake insurers already use this technology here. So, and there's not children dying on the streets. So clearly that's an overblown concern, but that's the, I think, failing position of the critics of this, is they want to act as if this is unvetted technology. Not only do we use it in California for earthquake insurance, every other state uses this. Yeah. So I don't know what their motivation is in trying to stop this, but the lack of the ability to accurately project future losses is a major, major reason why companies are being forced to stay on the sidelines and stay out of high-risk areas.
Oh, absolutely. No, I mean, and mitigation is a huge factor that we now need to force mitigation or require people to house harden and have the protective barriers. But so we have this new plan, forward thinking, look at climate change, look at the future, plan it, rate for it appropriately. Is this going to go in effect in the near future? Are we looking at the next 12 months?
Well, and so there's a catch.
There's always a catch.
And there's a second rating element dealing with the cost of reinsurance, which we can get into if you want. But the concept, as we understand it, because obviously, we saw the press release, or we saw the press conference like everyone else, and there was only a certain amount of information in there. Yeah. But it seems like the concept is the two areas where California is the extreme outlier, the use of backward-looking models or backward-looking averages, and acting as if companies don't actually buy reinsurance, which the only reason we have as much coverage we have in California is because of reinsurance, and we can get into that. But it seems as if the department is ready to commence a regulation development process that would allow insurance companies to make rate filings that use these models and that use California-specific reinsurance costs, but only if their rate filing also demonstrates sort of an anti-cherry picking concept. So under the concept, it seems as if it's going to be companies will have a burden that, as much as we've griped about the rating system, and we've said these two rating concepts are the biggest thing that companies need in order to expand their operations in California, to some extent, the state of California is saying, okay, we're calling you on it. If you want to use these two things, your filing also has to show how you'll take your share of higher risk business. And so we don't know the details totally, but it seems as if the department has a concept of defining distressed areas. And we don't know if that means, a city that has a high number of fair plan policies, let's say, as an indicator of a market not working properly, or if they have some other idea, we don't know. But they're going to define distressed areas, and then you take the sum total of all those distressed areas, and what a company would have to do is to show whatever their statewide market share, let's say it's 10%, just for sake of the example. Then in the distressed areas, you have to make sure your market share is at least 8.5% of the distressed areas. So you have to make sure your market share in distressed areas is at least 85% of your statewide market share. And then there's a second component where a company would have to outline how it will go to the FAIR plan and show with its new eligibility rules that would be in its filing, how many policies could they take out of the FAIR plan. So an explicit FAIR plan depopulation effort.
Okay, so I was wondering about that.
So it's a trade-off. It's not as if companies even though our members think modeling and reinsurance is just a normal part of the business. Heaven forbid we think that, because every other state thinks that. And for reinsurance as well, earthquake insurers already use their reinsurance costs and they use forward-looking modeling, right? So all our position has been is if it's good enough for earthquake insurers, why can't wildfire insurers? This is another catastrophic peril that we have to figure out how we fund these losses. But it looks like that we have not convinced the state of what we think is a sound argument. We've only partially convinced them, because they're saying, well, if you want to use these two things for wildfire, you better step up and show how you're going to write in high risk areas, and you're going to take people out of the FAIR Plan. So that's a concept that at least I think the companies are willing to explore. There's a ton of details, what will be the definition of distressed areas, what will be the rules for how a model is used, what will be the rules for reinsurance costs they can put into their filing. And then, once the department gets those rules out there, then it'll take probably several months for companies to figure them out and figure out how to make a rate filing under these new rules. And then how long is it going to take that first guinea pig to get their rate filing approved? I mean, under current law, it takes...
Yeah, it's years. Sometimes it's 1 or 2 years.
Yeah, under current law, as of end of 2022, the average homeowner's filing took over 340 days from start to finish. So you're talking about almost a year.
Yeah.
So, we're talking about regulation development that'll probably take us well into 2024. Then companies will have to come up with these filings. That'll probably take at least a month or two, I would think. Hopefully they'll be ready to go when they're allowed to. And then, with the first filing, we're going to get pretty robust public discussion. There's going to be outside lawyer groups that are going to intervene and want their say and their piece of the pie when it comes to them getting compensated. And so that's going to take 6 months at the best. I would assume it's probably going to take a year or more, right? So that puts us into 2025. So the dance here is, the more onerous that we make it on companies to be able to use these tools, that's fine if people want to be tough on them. That's just going to delay, though, their ability to actually take to market a program for depopulating the FAIR Plan and writing in higher risk areas under rates that take into consideration models and reinsurance. The harder we make it, the longer it's going to take for the market to respond.
So there is definitely, it's extremely complicated. It's not just, hey, you can now look at climate change, you can now look forward, you can now adjust your rates, but you have to have skin in the game. It's basically like pay to play. So
That's right.
have to actually be in those high risk areas if you want those rates. And you have to depopulate the FAIR Plan, which is very oversaturated right now, which is terrifying, as you said earlier.
Yeah.
And then we're talking 2025, 2026 to be able to actually implement these things because of all the time frames when we're faced with mega fires now.
It's I mean, on one level, I understand, first of all, I mean, it's understandable why Commissioner Lara would want to put the screws to the companies and say, hey, if you're going to do this, you need to step up and have a consumer benefit. So we understand where he's coming from.
I get that. Yeah.
No problem. Devil's in the detail on, all these implementation things. But one thing we do recommend strongly is we don't need a long drawn out rulemaking process, because we already have rules for earthquake insurers to do this. All we have to do is just go to the regulations. This is not a legislative thing. These are Department of Insurance regulations where they can go in, and where it says earthquake insurers can use these models, they can just say property insurance companies can use these models. Earthquake insurers are in a regulation allowed to use reinsurance, just add property insurers. We don't need a highly complicated thing that's going to take a year to do. Just let companies, because even letting companies make these filings under an abbreviated rule change, the Department of Insurance still controls all the cards. It's not like a company can just start charging whatever it wants to charge. It has to go to the department and undergo a pretty rigorous level of scrutiny. Obviously, if you're looking at a filing for a year, that's not a free ride, right? So, what other business has to wait a year before they can change their prices in an inflationary environment like this? Heck, we're getting, 18% mandatory tips put on our restaurant bills. And we just kind of like look at it and say, oh, that makes sense. But, when we're talking about one of the most climate impacted business sectors, which is the property insurers, we say, oh, we're going to take a year for you to change your prices. And then if in the meantime you have to take actions to protect yourself financially, we're going to get mad at you. I don't think that's right.
Well, you're not thinking about the needs of the consultants and attorneys that have to have their billable rates.
Hey, as an attorney, I like high fees. Don't get me wrong.
But I've definitely seen one or more ordinances in my life, and they do have their consultants and lawyers, and they do take their time, and they get their billable rates. So I get it. I get exactly why it's taking a year. And so what I'm not going to take up too much more of your time, but what can we look forward to? I mean, it does sound in theory pretty darn good.
Yeah.
But it's complicated. There are a lot of hiccups and roadblocks in the way, and you cannot bully an insurance company. They will just be like, we're out. I mean, they will take their big red ball and go home if they feel they're being bullied. So are we seeing progress? Are we seeing that this could really happen?
Well, I think it could really happen. And the important thing to remember is that in any of these regulatory changes, the Department of Insurance still holds all the cards.
Yes.
There's not ever going to be a time when an insurance company just gets to say, oh, I feel like changing my prices. That's not the way it works. The Department of Insurance always, even under their new regulations, will be able to look at a filing and say, we don't think you're doing a good enough job of a fair plan depopulation plan. Come back to us. And if you want the rate increase, then do better. So that's going to be just a big tug of war there between the insurance companies and the Department of Insurance. And no one can say how that's going to go. I think in the short term, though, one thing that worries me the most is the FAIR plan. If we go into peak fire season in late November, early December, and we get one of these wind-driven fires that just engulfs a community,
yep.
We're going to be in a situation where small companies could be bankrupted and large companies could have a good chunk of their surplus depleted when the FAIR plan has to call for capital from these companies.
In addition to that, people will lose their jobs if they have to cut back on how much people it'll have a domino effect, chain reaction.
It will be devastating. And it's because the FAIR plan's complicated. No one really, it's easy to take shots at the FAIR plan, but they provide such a critical backstop. I mean, the reason why people can close escrows now is because of the FAIR plan.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And as much as people don't like it, what do they expect? The FAIR plan only takes high-risk policies. So on average, their losses will be higher than a normal statewide insurance company, and their prices will therefore be higher. So whenever you go to the FAIR plan, you're always going to pay more. So no one should ever want to be in the FAIR plan, but it provides guaranteed availability to allow you to close escrow, and there's value in that. Mortgage lenders, they recognize the FAIR plan for what it does. So in the short term, we're going to be leaning on the FAIR plan more and more. And the longer it takes to fix these regs and get these new filings where companies can increase their eligibility, we're just going to have FAIR plan growth. And if the FAIR plan growth gets out of control, that's a problem. Now, there has to be some mechanism where if we want to just say, let's let the FAIR plan blow up and do this capital call for insurance companies, that's a one and done type of thing, right? Because if companies know that they're going to have to keep paying hundreds of millions or perhaps billions of dollars out of their surplus, they're going to stop writing in California. They're going to reduce their market share because their FAIR plan assessment is based on what % of the market do they write. Right? So there has to be some sort of mechanism to fund these FAIR plan costs. Yeah. Now, we think we shouldn't be in this position because if admitted market prices, if the regular company prices were sufficient, then companies would increase their eligibility and they wouldn't have to go to the FAIR plan. So in our zeal to hold down these prices of the insurance companies, we've actually gotten a worse solution for policyholders because they can't get regular insurance. They have to go to the FAIR plan and they pay more.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's called the insurance of last resort for a reason.
And so we should want to get people out of the FAIR plan. But the question is, what should we do in the meantime until the market can heal and until we can depopulate the FAIR plan? Now, when an insurance company, a normal insurance company, goes bankrupt, there's another insurance industry group called the California Insurance Guarantee Association, CIGA. They step in, and whatever shortfall that the insurance company has, CIGA funds those claims. So the insurance industry funds those claims.
Ooh.
So when 𝐕𝒍𝒂𝒎💏 Property and Casualty was a small insurance company that finally was bankrupted by the Paradise Fire, they didn't have enough money to pay their claims.
Yeah.
And so 𝐂𝐤𝐥𝐥, which is just the insurance industry, injected capital into 𝐕𝒍𝒂𝒎💏 Property Casualty to make sure that those claims could be paid. Well, 𝐂𝐤𝐥 has a cash balance, but what happens when it doesn't? The way California statute is set up is whenever 𝐂𝐤𝐥 runs short, they turn around, just like the FAIR Plan, to the insurance companies, and they say, hey, I'm $1 billion short, give me that money. And so if it's a homeowner's company that goes bankrupt, they would go to State Farm. In a $1 billion situation, they'd say, you write 21%, give me $420 million. And the way that statute works, State Farm is required under California statute to then turn around and take that bill for $420 million and apply a surcharge to their homeowners insurance policies. And it's separately written on the policy, and it says this additional amount is to cover the claims costs related to an assessment from 𝐂𝐤𝐥 that had to pay, 𝐕𝒍𝒂𝒎💏 Property Casualty's bankruptcy claims. So that's the way it works now. When a company goes bankrupt, we have a system where we all pay. We all step up and help those people who lost their homes in Paradise. We all step up and pay more on our bills so that they get their claims paid. So we have a socializing mechanism for a bankrupt company. Well, 𝐂𝐤𝐥 doesn't apply to the FAIR Plan because the FAIR Plan cannot technically go bankrupt.
Because we have two things here. We have FAIR and 𝐂𝐤𝐥.
Yep. And so the question is, what happens if the FAIR Plan goes bankrupt? It can't, because it's 100% backed up by the insurance industry.
Who's also doing 𝐂𝐤𝐥.
Well, who's also funds 𝐂𝐤𝐥, that's right. But I say fund, but remember, they turn around and socialize 𝐂𝐤𝐥's costs across their policyholder base. So I think the public policy question is, do we want to let the FAIR Plan grow, run out of money, assess the insurance companies and bankrupt the companies? Or do we want to treat the FAIR Plan running out of money the way we treat an ordinary insurance company running out of money? Where when the FAIR Plan assesses the insurance companies pay it, but they turn around and they're allowed to recoup some money in order to keep them in business. So you can see the public policy challenges with that, because all of a sudden you have non-FAIR Plan policyholders. They're going to have to pay more on their bills to pay for FAIR Plan claims. I could see why people wouldn't like that. But I'll tell you what those same people wouldn't like is the FAIR Plan bankrupting the insurance companies and not having them serve them at all, right? So there's no good answer here. The perils of both inflation and climate change, they've put insurance companies in a position where they're scrambling to marshal enough resources to fund these operations. And if we don't want to allow them to do it, they're just simply going to keep pulling back. So it's not as if I can give you a rosy perspective here. They're all bad choices. But funding higher claims costs because of inflation and climate change, what else are we supposed to do? With health insurance, when we ultimately decided on the Affordable Care Act, it was after a lengthy debate about, do we want the taxpayers to have a publicly funded insurance company for health insurance? And we said no. And we rejected, President Obama and then Speaker Pelosi, they rejected the notion of a single payer plan or a public option or these publicly funded things. And they said, let's stick with the private insurance industry. And so in doing so, now we have in California, the exchange covered California, and they have an annual negotiation with these insurance companies. And nobody looks at those insurance companies and said, hey, we expect you to serve everybody, but we're going to suppress the price you can charge. They don't do that. They negotiate a market rate. And then we as a society decided if the price of that market rate is too high, the federal government oftentimes will subsidize 90 or even 100% of the health insurance premiums that people pay. So we don't want homeowners insurance to get to the point where the claims costs are so profoundly high that they generate higher premium indications and people can't afford it. But in the short term, that's what's going to happen. prices are going to go up. How can they not go up when we're going to have a change in climate and we have the inflation that we have? So people who talk about climate change, they can't then also ignore the perils of climate change, the costs of climate change. That's what's happening. And so in the short term, prices are going to go up and nobody wants that. But it would be a fool's game to think that's a real strategy in the long term. In the long term, we have to get serious about reducing the hazard that exists in our landscape and that's near homes. And we keep building more and more expensive homes in areas that can burn.
Oh, yes.
And, you know, that's going to lead to more insurance losses, and that's going to lead to more system costs and ultimately more premium increases. And the only way that we're going to decelerate those premium increases is to have, I think, a more comprehensive discussion about how do we want to live in California. And, you know, I live in a wooded community, and I know right now the people in my community, they don't want to cut any trees. They don't want to cut any bushes. That's why we moved here, right? But at the same time, if we don't start having a discussion about, well, what are some standards for fuel mitigation that actually will reduce the hazard of a huge fire, we're going to have to get to that. And that's going to be very difficult to get communities to really face up to what it's going to take to lower hazard. But if we don't have that, we're just going to keep chasing higher premiums because losses are going to keep going up.
Yeah, we need to mitigate the problem so, you know, we can reduce the risk overall. If someone wanted more information, could they reach out to the PIFC and find out more?
Oh yeah, PIFC.org. You bet.
Yeah. No, it's very important the work you're doing, because I know you've been working on this for a while. You and I have kept in touch over the years. I mean, literally years, folks. Rex has been on this. It's not an easy answer. And I know there was a lot of information given that probably confused some people. But the end result is the risk is higher. We have to mitigate, meaning we have to stop the problem before it starts. So cutting back trees, cutting back bushes, no wood chips around the house. That's really important.
5 foot non-combustible zone.
Exactly. 5 foot non-combustible zone, meaning no wood chips around your house, no bushes, no trees, rocks, deserts.
If people want to see the research, you know, the insurance industry, they fund an incredible amount of research on this. You know, we've done it for a long time on auto. That's the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, you know, the crash test dummies. That's the insurance industry funding that. On the property side, it's the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, IBHS. And they're really the premier structural research organization. And they have a standard, at least for home hardening standards in defensible space, called the Wildfire Prepared Home Standard. And if you go to IBHS.org, you'll see wildfire prepared home information. And the insurance companies have started taking the wildfire prepared home sort of system of mitigations. It's not a la carte. You have to do everything in the system, right? Because fires like water, it will find the weak spot. So just because you put mesh on your attic vent, if your eaves are still uncovered, the ember will get in there. So it doesn't matter that you put the mesh on your attic vent. You have to do it all. Okay. And so insurance companies have started putting in their latest rounds of homeowners filings, standards for the wildfire prepared home system of mitigation. Now, the next step, and it's a much more complicated but important step, is when can we get standards for community hardening?
Thank you for bringing that up, because most people think, well, I harden my house, I'm good. It's like, not really. It has to be community wide, because the fire is not just going to hop your house. It's going to go right through you.
Yeah. And wildfire prepared home is really focused mostly on ember cast. Yeah. So, you know, when you have these big fires that are casting embers a half a mile or a mile away, wildfire prepared home is designed to stop that ember from smoldering and starting a fire. But when you talk about a fire like Paradise, you're not talking necessarily about ember fires. You're talking about once structures ignite, then you've got either radiant heat or direct flame contact from one house to another. And when the house goes up, it becomes fuel. And then you just have fires cascading through a community. So while we encourage people to take seriously the recommendations of the wildfire prepared home system, that's not going to stop an Oakland Hills fire from consuming a community. It's folly to think that what I do on my property even if it's cinder block and a metal roof, can stop a fire like Paradise. There was a home in Paradise that exploded from the inside that had cinder block and a metal roof, because the heat we're talking about was so extensive that you just can't stop this. I mean, let's not be so arrogant when it comes to thinking what we can do to stop, 100 or 200 foot high flame with 40, 50, 60 mile an hour winds in a dry, hot environment. There's limits to what we can control with our own actions.
Oh, yeah.
And so
the speed of which the fires are now traveling is astronomical.
It's jaw dropping. And so I think where our next step is, I think the burden that we rightly face is to come up with what we think the science is on what a community can do, so that we can give guidance to a homeowners association or to a city council, so that they can start to have a community discussion of, well, we know the fire is likely to come from the Northeast and there's a bunch of fuel up there, so let's focus up there. But to do it with guidance from insurers, so that when they spend these precious resources on fuel reduction, that they know it's going to make a difference on the eligibility for insurance in their communities. I think that's an area where we can do better, but we can't do it now because there's no research that actually has where we can understand the science of that.
It's a good point.
And so there's lots of researchers all across California trying to figure this out, because everyone wants to then start their own company and make a bunch of money selling.
Yeah, I've run into those guys. Everyone's got, I won't even get into some of the people I've run into. But IBHS.org is actually very good, because they actually have an entire site where they will build houses and set them on fire to see what happens.
They have a big airplane hangar in South Carolina with all these jet engines built into the side of a huge wall. And then they'll build 2 homes, one to wildfire prepared home standards and one not. And then they'll just, with these jet engines, start throwing embers up against these structures. And then they have a rigorous scientific approach towards understanding what would stop a house from going up or not. The videos are amazing.
They are. It's actually really cool to watch those videos, and they do many different iterations of that. But I'm going to close this out with, how do people get in touch with you, Rex? How can they learn more? I mean, IBHF, IBHS.org, PIFC.org, and then any other resources that people could, because people are really paying attention to this now. They're scared.
Yeah, another lesser known but tremendous organization is called NIST. It's a federal agency, NIST, as in Tom. And go to NIST's website. Their research is compelling. They're every bit as valuable as IBHS is as well.
Oh, fabulous. That's a new one to me, so I will check that out, because I honestly think if we're going to, the wildfires do not care about state lines. This is a federal level response. We need to just have some rules out there. So guys, thank you so much. Thank you, Rex, for your information. Very important stuff that you're doing. And I know you've spent years working on this, so please keep pressing forward. I know it's difficult. So thank you, Rex. My name is Wendy Nystrom. I'm your host with Environmental Social Justice, and we will catch you guys next time. Take care. Bye.